Welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm Jonathan Krasner, a professor at the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Spotlight session on Israel education, co-sponsored with the Journal of Jewish Education. The mission of the Mandel Center is to develop and promote scholarship in Jewish education in order to make a deep and lasting difference to the lives of learners and the vibrancy of Jewish education. This session and our other sessions are a way of serving our mission by sharing ideas with the world, especially with Jewish educators and Jewish leaders. In our spotlight sessions, we bring together a small group of scholars to tackle a topic within Jewish education. For example, in the past, we've had spotlight sessions on gap years in Israel, on Jewish education after October 7th, and on other topics. All of those events are available for viewing on our website and YouTube channel and on our podcast. Today's event will also go up on those channels in a few days. Before we start our conversation, of course, I want to acknowledge the events that are taking place right now in the Middle East, in Iran and in Israel, and to say that we all pray for the safety and well-being of everybody in our orbit and in the larger orbit of the world. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that Alex, one of our speakers, who I'll be introducing in a minute or two, is joining us from Israel. And if air raid sirens go off or anything like that, we fully expect him to do the safe thing and to take care of himself, to go to a safe room, and we will carry on without him. But we're so glad that you're able to be with us. We hope that you'll be able to be with us for the whole time, but we fully understand if you need to take care of yourself. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing an important new article that was recently published in the Journal of Jewish Education online and will soon be published in the print version of the Journal of Jewish Education, entitled Ages and Stages of Learning About Israel, a developmental review of the literature of Israel education. And as I mentioned, we have the authors of this article here with us this afternoon. Before I introduce them, let me just say a few words about our topic today. Israel education occupies a uniquely charged and consequential space within contemporary Jewish life. For many Jews, especially in the diaspora, Israel is not only a geopolitical reality, but also a touchstone of identity and peoplehood and memory and moral imagination. How Jews learn about Israel shapes how they understand Jewish history, collective responsibility, nationalism, democracy, conflict, and pluralism. At a moment when Israel is both central to the community discourse and deeply contested in broader public arenas, the educational processes through which learners encounter Israel cognitively, emotionally, and ethically carry long-term implications for Jewish continuity, for civic participation, and for communal cohesion. Yet, despite the field's visibility and urgency, research on Israel education is often developed in fragmented pockets rather than as a coherent, cumulative body of knowledge. And that's really where the launching off point, I think, for this article that we're going to be discussing is. So let me just say a few words about each of our guests, because more information is available just a click away. And then we'll dive into the conversation. So first, Sivan Zakai is a professor at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles, and she's the director of the Children's Learning About Israel Project and co-director of Project Orly, Research and Leadership in Israel Education, and she's the author of My Second Favorite Country, How American Jewish Children Think About Israel. Alex Pomson is the principal and managing director of Rosov Consulting. Among his numerous books and articles is Inside Jewish Day Schools, Leadership, Learning and Community, which he wrote with Jack Wertheimer. And Matt Reingold is the senior project lead at Rosov Consulting Canada. And he is the author and editor of a number of books, including Education After October 7th, essays about teaching and learning in the Jewish diaspora. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all. Okay, and before we jump into questions, let me just tell our audience members or remind our audience members that this is a webinar format. So you cannot ask questions directly, but we really invite you to put questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those questions later in our program. So let me start with you, Alex. Tell us what prompted the three of you to write this article. What prompted you to to undertake this research, especially at this particular moment in time? And why did you decide to organize it around ages and stages rather than around, let's say, institutions or ideologies or programs? What were you thinking?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be doing this and to be doing this together with colleagues and friends. And that actually is a useful segue into the answer to your question, is that like plenty of research, and perhaps not so often noted, I think the work began with relationships, the relationships between the three of us, and an opportunity we had to form a panel together at the Network for Research in Jewish Education, co-sponsors of this event, getting on for 2.5 years ago at Brandeis University. We each presented about a different piece of our work. If I remember correctly, Sivan, the participants in your longitudinal study may still have been in elementary school at the time, and you were sharing their work. Matt was sharing about cartoons dealing with contemporary Israeli society, Yom HaZikaron in particular. That's something that stayed with me. And I was sharing about work that the Rosov Consulting team had done in partnership with Onward Israel. So we were each looking at different populations who were participating in experiences of Israel education, or who had opportunities to talk about how they thought about Israel. And we thoroughly enjoyed learning from one another in that session, and came out of the room saying, maybe we should write something about all of this. And as our conversations kind of took shape, the notion of looking at the field developmentally really kind of matured. We had looked at different slices of the developmental trajectory, and there were slices that we had not looked at. And we felt that there was possibly a story to tell. And I personally have been a fan of developmentalists, developmental research, longitudinal research. Kohlberg and Piaget were kind of formative readings in my own training, but there have been others. Christian Smith, Kieran Egan is another one. There is something almost soap opera-like. What's going to happen in the next episode, as it were, about the developmental frame? And it had never previously been applied to the field of Israel education. And it seemed there was an opportunity to say something new, something fresh about continuities in the field and changes in the field. Changes, not, I don't mean historically so much, but changes between different sectors. And so that's how the ideas came together. And the developmental frame, I think, has been really quite generative for the three of us.
Great, great. Matt, the article argues that the field has produced many snapshots, but it's lacked a developmental collage. What does the developmental lens reveal about what does it reveal that we wouldn't be able to see if we analyzed the topic, let's say by looking at I don't know, different sectors, like schools or travel programs. What new, what does this add in a new way to what we already know?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to you and Brandeis and the Journal for hosting us. I want to echo what Alex said. The next episode, part of what was really enjoyable about writing this process was that whenever I would go in to check our shared document, was seeing the next installation of the work, and that as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, we each tackled different developmental areas based on our areas of research. And part of what was always really enjoyable was learning from each other about those different stages. What really emerged for us when we were able to look at it through this developmental lens was identifying where gaps were. That we knew going in that there's been lots of research about schools and that there's been lots of research about camps. We knew also that there's been a lot of travel research for mostly secondary school students and for college with birthright and other immersive experiences. And based on work that Sivan and I had done a few years ago, we also knew that there was less research about museum experiences. But and so we knew that there were those gaps already. What the developmental lens afforded us was the opportunity to see gaps that we might not have otherwise noticed. And what really emerged through the data was that the research literature is very unevenly distributed. What we saw was that there was some research in elementary, there was then a dip in research in middle school, and then it went back up as we moved into intermediate years. And then it goes down a little bit as we hit the college age years. And then as we hit the life cycle of where like most of us spend the majority of our time, the post college to like whenever the end of our life, first of all, developmentally, it's all been put in one large bucket, which raises significant like challenges because where a 30-year-old is at who might not have children yet is very different than a 30-year-old who has children, but also saying that a 50-year-old and a 70-year-old and a 30-year-old, developmentally, we've lumped them all into one category as a wider community, but that we know virtually nothing that is actually happening in Israel education about this group. And without examining it through this developmental lens and saying, okay, we're going to shine a spotlight on these 6 stages, we all sort of knew-ish that there really wasn't much, but until we had done it in this way, we didn't realize how wide the gaps were and how deep we know about some areas and how we know virtually nothing about other areas. And for us, that calls out the need to deepen our understanding because if we spend the majority of our lives in this adulthood phase, we need to deepen our understanding of what it means to study about Israel in this phase. And so I think that's one key part of it for us.
Yeah, I know for me as a historian, it was very compelling and a welcome change to see how you expanded what we think of as education. I think that intuitively, a lot of people just think of education as something that little kids do, something that ends maybe in college or at least with the end of your formal education years. And the idea that we talk about education as a lifelong process, but a lot of times I think that's just lip service. But you guys take it really seriously, and I really appreciated that about the about this article. But Sivan, I'm sure there must have been trade-offs. So tell me a little bit about what was gained and what was lost by using this developmental framework.
So we came to it with 6 categories that don't come from us. They come from a larger developmental literature that is way beyond the work of Jewish education. And we sort of divided the lifespan into 6 categories: early childhood and childhood, which is often called middle childhood, early adolescence and adolescence, emerging adulthood, and adulthood. Um, And one of the reasons that we did that is because we know from the larger developmental literature that there are distinct things that people in each stage are capable of and ready to think about, and some things that are a stretch, and different ideas that might matter more to young adolescents than to children or to adults. Um, but it actually turns out that much of the research literature is not organized by those categories. So this is especially true as we think about early adolescence and adolescence. There are many, many studies in Jewish education focused on Israel education that talk about teenagers and that have done sort of surveys of Jewish teenagers. That is good. That is important. We want that data. And also, developmentally, a 13-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 19-year-old might be in three radically different developmental categories. A 13-year-old is in early adolescence, a 17-year-old is in the throes of adolescence, and a 19-year-old is already pushing towards emerging adulthood. And so when we look at Jewish teenagers as a category, it actually obscures some of the real developmental changes. And part of what was challenging for us in this work was trying to disaggregate or see what is possible even to see about early adolescence in particular. As Matt spoke about a minute ago, we know a little bit about early childhood, a good amount about elementary school, and not that much actually about the special developmental phase of middle school. And part of the reason we don't know that much is because teens are often lumped together in the Jewish educational research, even though they're not in the developmental research. So we did our best to try and see what it is we could learn about each of these stages, but it's tricky because much of the existing research doesn't map it out in the same conceptual way that we do, and we do it based on a larger developmental literature.
Did you find it challenging to, sort of, I guess, put a back seat on the different institutional settings? I'm thinking, for example, of literature that we're all very familiar with about, let's say, Israel trips and what it means to be a tourist, and how, being a tourist is a particular lens that you bring to, to education as opposed to sitting in a classroom or something like that.
So one of the interesting things that I think that we saw in putting these all together as developmental stages was that the idea of a tourist actually comes up for every developmental stage. In early childhood and childhood, it's often pretend tourism, imaginary tourism. As we get towards early adolescence and for sure adolescence and emerging adulthood, there's been a lot of emphasis on the actual trip, but we see certain practices that we notice are incredibly common. The travel or tourism, even if it's imaginary, is one category. The mifgash, a meeting between North Americans and Israelis, is another example that we think actually weave throughout the lifespan, but function differently in different developmental phases, and actually raised for us a profound question about common practices that are often called best practices.
Yeah. So
John, I mean, if there's
go ahead,
possible to jump
jump
in
in,
on that,
Alex.
I mean, just to kind of piggyback on what Sivan has just said, I mean, yes, each stage can be identified as different, but as Sivan has indicated, by looking across stages, we really kind of identified the problem that Israel education is seeking to resolve at its kind of most fundamental level, which is, in a sense, Israel's foreignness. Like Israel as a foreign country sounds a little banal, but kind of socially, culturally, historically, politically, so much of about it is different from the lived experiences of uh, learners of whatever age. The work of Israel education seems to spend so much of its time kind of trying to overcome that foreignness, as Sivana said, through the Mifgash and the Israel trip, physically bringing people together, but also through certain kind of educational modalities that aspire to translate what Israel means in one kind of cultural language into a language that is more familiar to the learner in wherever in the world.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, Matt, what would it take for the field to stop thinking in terms of describing what educators do and then to start identifying what actually works and for whom it works? Because as I think Sivan and Alex were kind of suggesting what might work in one setting or particularly with one developmental stage might not necessarily work as well with another group and another stage.
Yeah, so certainly that idea that you just said, Jonathan, is really important. That the practices that work with one stage, even if there are these commonalities that Alex and Sivan have talked about, pretend trip, real trip, what works in the early adolescent phase is very different than what would work in the early childhood phase. What we encountered were these phrases best practices, and we understand why people would want to use the phrase best practices because if we want to do good Israel education or any education in general, words like best connote the exact things that we want to be accomplishing. And within the education scholarly literature, best practices has a very particular connotation, which means that it's something that's been independently investigated and compared to other practices and using control and sample groups to determine is this practice actually a best practice or is it just a good practice or even a common practice? And what we try to distinguish in the article is good practices, common practices, and identifying that in Israel education, we don't really have an understanding of best practices. And there are a number of reasons why that is the case. A huge part of it is that we really don't do deep quantitative and control and variable group testing in Jewish education. There just aren't enough studies being done and population groups in order to really determine what is best practice. That being said, what we try to offer in the article is by identifying for each of the six developmental stages a literature review of where are students at during that phase, and then organizing that section around what are the practices that we see happening in Israel education. We try to identify whether there is alignment or misalignment happening, meaning whether the practices that are happening are good, effective practices, or whether there is a developmental mismatch, that learners are either being introduced too early or too late to content that is, as a result, too challenging, as we saw in some of the early elementary material, or potentially too late, that when early adolescents are intellectually capable of doing certain high level thinking and their teachers are not engaging them in that type of high level thinking, we see that there is that mismatch. And part of what we try to identify in the article is a move towards a more developmentally attuned Israel education practice. Ideally, to come back to your question, it would be wonderful if we could start doing control group sampling to figure out what are really the best practices. But we also know that that might not be the case and it might not be realistic. But I think that in an ideal world, what we'll start to see is developmentally attuned practices because what that does is it allows learners and teachers to experience a developmentally appropriate Israel education that challenges students to think in new ways, that introduces content to them in ways that they are capable of, and experiencing rich and meaningful Israel education at a developmentally appropriate level.
So as I'm thinking about that, I sort of put my teacher hat on and I think to myself, well, when I'm prepping for a class, uh, I think about my learners, I think about what they can do, and I try to develop a set of activities or a set of assessments or whatever it is based on my sense of what the developmental level of the students are. So I guess I'm wondering, apropos what you were saying, Matt, and any of you can answer this. Do you feel like you're documenting kind of what teachers kind of know intuitively, or do you feel like you're adding something to our understanding that intuition wouldn't be necessarily a reliable predictor of that? I don't know if any of you want to take that.
Sivan, you can take it.
I think that we were all surprised by some of the things that we found, and we spend a lot of time as the three of us in Israel education spaces. And so I think I have a hunch that part of what we are revealing here is all of the ways that our guts may be a little bit unsettled by what we see in some of the data. So what you're talking about, of course, we as educators, we want to think about where learners are, think about where they might get to, and help them move along that path. But part of what we consistently saw that we didn't know when we went into this process is being able to identify a series of places where we think that common practices are mismatched with learners' developmental needs. And as Matt said, in some cases, that developmental mismatch was because we might be overshooting, and in some cases, that developmental mismatch is because we might be undershooting. Um, and we imagine that some tinkering to align might be in order.
Yeah, I was thinking about how I know that your research talks sometimes, Sivan, about how in early education we sometimes underestimate, I think, the cognitive abilities of our learners. Yeah. Are there other examples is there like someone want to bring up another example of something that surprised you, Matt or Alex?
Sure. I don't recall if we cited it in this specific article because it might have come out after we had gone to print. But there's been some really fascinating research by Ezra Kapelowitz and people from his team about teacher orientations towards Israel education. And they use language um, about essentially creating a space where the teacher creates a warm, welcoming, almost sheltering environment that nurtures the Israel education space. I can't remember the exact word that they use. Um, Solidarity, so that's the word. They talk about teaching for solidarity. And as part of his work, what that meant for many of these educators was not introducing nuance and complexity and introducing any type of critique or challenge of Israel, because what they wanted to do post October 7th was really create this warm, safe space. And the developmental literature, it clearly recognizes learners' abilities to handle competing and complementary narratives that don't always act in accordance with each other. And that when educators embrace this dominant philosophy of solidarity or any other of the ones that he mentions, but overwhelmingly the teachers identified as solidarity educators, they're not doing their learners um, service, but they're also not doing dignifying their learners' abilities. And so that's another example that I can think of where there is that mismatch.
Great. And Alex, before we get into, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty in a minute, but before we do, I guess I have one more question, kind of on a preliminary level. Since you're sitting, close to or at the top of, a research firm, maybe you have some insight about this. Why do you think it is that the research hasn't been evenly distributed between these different life stages? Why is it that so much of our research tends to focus, let's say, on teens or tends to focus on certain groups, whereas other groups are almost entirely ignored in the literature?
I'm probably the last person you might describe as a Marxist, but it's hard to avoid a Marxist explanation in response to your question. Um, in many cases, the research follows the money. And uh, people are exploring those questions where there is funding, right? And there's a great deal of anxiety. And this is not, I'm not being cynical. I think there's a great deal of anxiety about the formative years, the years when young people develop attitudes towards and understandings of Israel. And funders and educators want to know more about those moments. And uh, emerging adolescence or the adolescent years really are years of great concern. Early childhood has increasingly become of concern too, not only when thinking about the young learner, but thinking about the young learner's family in relation to Israel. And so the larger, more complex projects are often um, predicated on the availability of funding. We think that is definitely one piece of the explanation. And the other is that when the funding isn't available, people tend to study those phenomena to which they have ready access. Israeli researcher Nama Sabah talks about conducting research in your backyard, not as something problematic, but as a context that you understand and to which you have access. And so there is a lot of work that looks at the classroom, in other words, the researcher's classroom, right? Matt did that for years, and that reflects real intimate understanding of the context or of particular settings where practitioner researchers have access to populations of interest. They don't have to negotiate entry. Those tend to be the drivers, and as we get to it shortly, that's the flip side of that is why there are certain domains or certain stages that are under-examined because the money isn't flowing there, and those who are conducting the research don't typically have ready access to those contexts.
Great. So let's use that as a segue to talking about the specific stages. And Alex, since you opened the door, let's talk about adulthood, which, as you all point out, is the least studied stage, despite being the longest phase of most people's lives. I guess I'm interested in what you think the consequences of this neglect are for Jewish communal life. And I guess more generally, to be a little provocative, if you were speaking to a funder, and I'm guessing that there may be some funders on this call, or there may be funders who watch this video afterwards. What case would you make to funders that, in fact, they should be devoting some of their, some of their funds to the study of adulthood?
Excellent. I mean, well, just to go onto the sausage factory floor for a minute, I would say, like when we divided up responsibilities here, I was looking at, or I was supposed to look at the literature on adult Israel education, and I found it grossly embarrassing that there were Matt and Sivan generating, pages of references, citations, and I think I came up with a measly three or four. One of which came from Sivan and Matt's book, a wonderful study there of an adult educator. There just wasn't literature. And I think the two of you both went off to double check whether I just hadn't been lazy here or, careless. There just isn't the material. Okay, so we feel pretty confident about that claim. What are the consequences of that? Well, quite fascinating, really. I mean, to kind of speculate on why this is, it goes back to something I said previously, that in many ways, adult Israel education, it has felt for many decades that the stakes in adult Israel education are lower than in other ages and stages, in that by the time people, our assumptions about adulthood are that by the time you get there, and for some of us it takes longer, and for some of us less time, we're kind of locked in more or less with a little bit of variation, but we're kind of settled so that it seems to be less interesting to look at the outcomes of adult Israel education because the audience is kind of locked in by the time they arrive. I think one can really question that, and I think the recent study by Robbie Greengrass and Abby Dalver-Stern looking at anti-Zionists and their trajectories speaks to the extent to which some of these things are really still quite dynamic beyond adolescence and emerging adulthood and really merits further examination. Um, Now, where was I going to go with this? So we made an assumption that people were locked in. The landscape or our assumptions have been sharply challenged by the events of October the 7th and how things have played out since. We have seen how adults have been profoundly unsettled by events in Israel and have moved further from Israel, and those who have moved closer to Israel. There is tremendous hunger to learn more about and to better understand, reflected in an extraordinary proliferation of podcasts and educational experiences and opportunities for people to better understand the present moment in Israel. It feels that something has been unlocked, that we're not so frozen, that adults are not so frozen in their relationships and understanding of Israel as they once were. And if we don't pay attention to the field of Israel education for adults, we will be missing the ferment and we will not be paying attention to the ways in which adults' relationships to Israel are shifting in the present moment.
And this question kind of came to me while you were talking. How do you um, distinguish between a developmental kind of approach and an approach that is focused on kind of the kind of external formative influences? So, like I'm thinking particularly of generational conflict around Israel, which we've seen a lot of since October 7th. And just how much of that has to do, it's a question, how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that people are in different developmental stages and that therefore they're looking at, they're processing things differently? How much of it has to do with the fact that adults grew up in a different kind of historic reality than kids are growing up in, and therefore the Israel that the adults know is not the same Israel in a way that the Israel that the kids know.
I can give you a short answer to that question. Those are precisely the kinds of research questions that the field needs and have not been explored until now, right? Particularly bringing a psychological developmental perspective to how people think about and talk about Israel. Um, in many ways, like our approach was to come from the practice of Israel education and to look at how it is conducted, what people seek to achieve, what kinds of challenges they face when they do that work. When it comes to adults, as I said before, hardly any has been written about that. I think it's fair to say almost that basically nothing has been written about how adults make sense of these things and what may be shaping their sense making, right?
Mhm.
The generational moment, the developmental moment, the historic moment, all of those absolutely should be in play when we think about adulthood. And as we've mentioned already, in adulthood does span generations um, and developmental phases, sub phases that really merit the kinds of consideration you're proposing.
Great. So I'm going to just stick with you for a minute, Alex, because we have you, and I'm not sure how long we're going to have you. So let me ask you a question about emerging
Not in
adults.
an existential sense, just like circumstantial. Right?
No, I mean, absolutely. We're just talking about
Yeah,
going to a safe
yeah.
room. We're not talking about anything more existential. So, in terms of emerging adulthood, there's been a lot of focus on Israel travel. Less focus, maybe until recently, on, for example, what's going on college campuses or what's going on, let's say, at Shabbat tables or other places where young adults might be congregating. What do you think is missing or might be missing from the what we know about young adult learning or emerging adult learning about Israel? And how should we think about a research agenda moving forward, in your opinion?
Right. I mean, it feels like a stage of tremendous opportunity. As you've said, so much attention has been focused on the Israel experience, and that very much reflects an assumption that for young people in that age, say between the ages of 18 and late 20s, right? Um, Israel education is at its most effective when conducted in situ in Israel. And it may well be that there has not been so much activity, so much engaging in Israel education, as opposed to Israel advocacy work with populations of that age. Um, it appears that that is shifting, right? That there are more opportunities for students, particularly university students, college students, to explore Israel while remaining at home, as it were. And uh, there's been very little written about such experiences, and until now. Uh, what has been explored, what certainly since October the 7th, is what are young people of those ages thinking about Israel and how have they responded to recent events? But there doesn't seem to be much attention to the practices of Israel education when directed to populations in that particular stage. And that really feels like, to respond to your question, really feels like where there's a research opportunity, and to go back to my previous point, where there may be an alignment between funder interest and research opportunity. Yeah.
Great, great.
Sorry,
Matt,
if I can just
yeah, yeah,
chime in on
sure,
that.
chime in.
That, for example, we know that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of campus Israel education professionals, and we know very little within the scholarly literature about what it actually involves to be teaching about Israel on a college campus. That we have the work that was from a few years ago after October 7th about changes on college campuses. There's work that Jonathan that you've published. But we know very, very little about the moves that campus Israel educators are making. And this is a little bit of a call out to the book that Sivan and I produced from about 2 years ago about shifting the focus away from the learner experience, but to the pedagogical moves that educators make when they go about teaching Israel. But even within our book, there was only one chapter about really campus Israel education within a Jewish student group center, and we really have there's no scholarly literature about what Israel campus professionals do. And I think that too is an area that really needs exploring because these are the people who are shaping the way that um, college students are thinking about Israel today.
Yeah. Funders take note. Um, Matt, since you're on the hot seat anyway, JFNA recently published a study that got a lot of attention about allergies to the word Zionist. In fact, that's a great kind of entree into a finding that you guys kind of talk about a little bit about how adolescents are really wrestling with this term Zionist. How do you think educators should approach identity language in ways that respect developmental questioning without, sort of evacuating moral and communal commitments? Is there a way to do that?
So I think it's an amazing question, and I think there's like an additional layer to it, which is that institutions have their own policies, and that educators need to feel safe enough within their own institutions to be able to navigate those conversations. And so, as much as students might want to have those conversations, if the educator doesn't feel that they will have the security from their supervisors to wade into those spaces, it can be extremely challenging to effectively do that as an educator. And that's work that Karen Freeman's article, Barriers to Entry, has really is now at this point like a seminal article that addresses the need for educators to feel that their employers give them that space. And even within that, educators need to find ways to give students the freedom to share their ideas within the classroom. That if students don't feel that they can share their ideas, if the space isn't a safe enough space where students feel respected and dignified to ask the questions that they want to be asking, to share the ideas that they want to be asking, they're not going to engage in real meaningful conversation with their educators. It is essential that the educator find a way to grapple with the challenges being presented by students. That if Israel is important enough to the educator and is important enough to the institution and its educators need to find ways to engage with the real questions and challenges that learners are having. In our article, we cited something written by Judith Shapiro, who did a study of, I believe it was Brandeis Marin in the Bay Area. Brandeis Marin, sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Brandeis Marin, thank you.
Which is a day
Where,
school, we should say, so that
sorry,
everyone
the day
on the
school
call
Brandeis
is on the same
in
wavelength
the Bay
there.
Area, that their entire Israel curriculum is built on two prongs. It's a prong of being pro-Israel or caring about Israel, with a simultaneous prong of being pro-questioning, where there are no questions that are off limits. Because if the school can't create space for that question, students are going to go and ask their questions elsewhere. They're going to shut down within the school or the camp, and they're going to take those questions elsewhere. And we've seen in the literature, in the news, things like You Never Told Me. Last week, Benji Davis delivered a webinar for Prisma about that very question of You Never Told Me, and that how are we creating spaces for our students to ask those questions? Because if they're not going to pay attention to the Israel education in their schools, and then we're going to lose that generation. And we must find ways to do that. And the article by Judith provides one playbook for how schools can do that. And so my answer is yes, absolutely. We can create spaces for doing that, but it requires safe risk on the part of the institution, really trained educators, likely educators who have done additional professional development about how to navigate these. And this is a whole other area of research literature I think that we haven't talked about, which is what does good Israel education professional development look like in service professional development? Because the needs of contemporary learners are different than from before October 7th, and we need to find ways to give space for that.
Do you have any preliminary ideas about what good professional development looks like, or was that more rhetorical?
No, it's not rhetorical. I think the first is recognizing that there are different types of professional development that educators need. There's content professional development, so deepening their understanding of Israel. There's educational professional development. How do I effectively run a classroom? And that we know the literature shows that there are many Jewish educators across North America who do not have that training, that within supplementary schools, within many schools within camps that they don't come armed with a bachelor's of education degree, a master's of education degree. They don't have fundamentals of pedagogy. What we also know is that there's pedagogical content knowledge, the subject matter that is uniquely specific to teaching Israel. And so the first thing that I would say is that as if we're thinking about developing professional development institutions or programs, we are dividing up and recognizing that the needs of our educators are not the same, and that we need to be offering resources and training in all three of those areas. And as part of, I think, to your specific question, what does Israel education, professional content knowledge mean? Is how to engage students in conversation and how to create space for dialogue when we disagree with each other, and how to create space within the room to hold multiple conflicting truths so that learners don't shut down when talking to each other, or that educators don't shut learners down, but that they know how to create space to open up those conversations, to hear other voices, to reflect the diversity within our North American spaces.
So you mentioned you never told me a minute or two ago, and I think that one of the interesting and maybe one of the heartening things that an Israel educator might take from reading this article is that, in fact, teaching the more complex full story of Israel doesn't necessarily alienate teens, and it may even deepen the connection. I think that a lot of educators are probably wary, certainly post October 7th, of getting into the moral dilemmas that occupation sort of presents among other topics. I think that for some people there may be a kind of instinctive, kind of reflexive move back to falafel and cherry tomatoes. Why don't you tell people listening why that wouldn't be the right move according to the research? Matt, you want to take that or somebody else?
I mean, in Al Regel Echad, it's not what learners want. I mean, students, when they are appropriately challenged, are really interested. And I think back to like one of the opening lines of an article by Robin Harper that I think Alex talked about, of that like Israel is fundamentally an interesting place. Like the meeting point of like religious groups and ethnic groups and national groups. Like how can you not be captivated by studying this? And to retreat to like this safe space of like pill cameras and cherry tomatoes um, does a disservice to our learners and what their capabilities are to like meaningfully learn about something. But I want to give others here opportunity to also chime in on that. Um,
Anybody else want to?
Well, I think actually in the sections that Matt wrote for this article, one of the things that he found by looking again, we were trying to look at all of the existing literature and what it already shows us. And he found so many cases, especially in adolescent education, where learners who learn about complicated, messy, and also kind of seedy underside aspects of Israel don't turn away. They turn towards more learning. And students who don't get to learn about that turn away from their Jewish educators. And so if you put all of that together, I think that underscores the point that Matt just made.
Great. So we were talking before about how adulthood is um, a veritable wasteland when it comes to research on Israel education. I think the other area that you all pointed out has been relatively understudied is early adolescence. And Sivan, I'm wondering what specifically would if a foundation gave you a grant, how would you develop a research agenda around this particular developmental stage? What kinds of questions would you ask? What do we need to know?
So, in the larger developmental literature, there are reams and reams of articles and books about the unique developmental needs of middle school learners. They are not like elementary school students. They are not like high school students. That's often why they get their own little bubbles in schools that aren't part of high schools and aren't part of elementary schools because they have unique developmental needs. We have only the tiniest windows in the existing developmental literature on middle school learners learning about Israel. Um, and we just need to know more. So my easiest answer is we need to better understand how middle school learners think about Israel, how they learn about Israel, the kinds of questions they have. Um, and also, we need to think carefully. We know that there, of course, are middle school Israel educators, but we have no literature about the kind of unique pedagogical moves that middle school educators use to help middle school learners who are, kind of stuck in that middle zone, not yet old enough for adolescence, definitely too old for the kind of pediatric approach to elementary school education. We just don't know enough. So anything that we could learn at this point would be more than we know now.
Great. Yeah, it really just reminds me of something that Larry Cuban and David Tyack wrote a long time ago about middle school or about junior high school and just how uh, we've historically been very, very bad at figuring out what this particular developmental stage needs in terms of education. And I guess that's just reflected in terms of the literature that we have as well. Um, Now, in terms of the elementary years, you suggest that curricula have often either underestimated or overestimated children's capacities. So, if you were advising a curriculum developer, Sivan, what key developmental insights do you think should guide the design of elementary Israel education?
Yeah, I just want to underscore something brilliant about your question, Jonathan, for all of the people who are here. In many of the other developmental phases, we found a developmental mismatch in one direction. So early childhood learners are often expected to do things that are just too hard for their brains to do, and um, adolescent learners are often not given enough challenge. But in elementary school, really in that kind of middle childhood developmental phase, we see the mismatch going in both directions. It's part of what makes that age unique in this developmental overview. So, on the overshooting, we often see an expectation of historicity and of geography, kind of understanding how the world is geographically outlaid is just too hard for children until they hit, in terms of geography, usually third or fourth grade, in terms of historical thinking, usually around fifth grade. And yet a lot of children's literature and children's textbooks assume that we're doing history and geography. So that is kind of a place where the alignment has to work in one direction. And the other direction is, as Matt alluded to earlier, conflict education. And the fact that even young learners, as early as kindergarten, are thinking about conflict, as early as second grade, are really kind of mentally mapping in their brains all sorts of things about conflict. And yet there's very, very few, if any, resources for conflict education and peace education for Jewish schools, camps, and other institutions that deal with elementary learners.
Great. I'm going to ask you in a minute.
Sorry,
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
if I may, and I think Sivan is not only are there not are we not seeing that that's happening in the classroom? There aren't the resources to help teachers do it. And there was a really interesting article by Mare Muller, Lyndall Miller, and Alana Rifkin-Gelnick about how post October 7th, a group of teachers in the New York area, without intending to, created a space for their students to begin to process October 7th. And it was like this ground up movement initiated by the students themselves who began doing like October 7th related creative play in the classroom. And the educators, it was this like aha, eye opening moment of like, we don't know how to manage this, but we know we can't shut it down. And we don't want to shut it down. We want to create space because they are working through something really important right now. And it provided opportunity for the educators to more deeply think about how do they frame the way they work with their youngest learners. And it challenged the teachers to think in new ways and was this incredibly powerful moment for them. Sorry to have interrupted you before.
No, not at all. Not at all. I appreciate you bringing it up. I mean, I think that it it underscores also, I think, how some of the progress that could be made may often be, let's say, tempered by fears that teachers might have about opening up conversations that they may not themselves feel like they're ready to facilitate, right? I mean, that is, it goes back to your point about the importance of teacher preparation and development, teacher development. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Um, I'm going to ask about early childhood, but before I do, I want to just remind all of our listeners that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We're going to get to those questions very shortly. But while you're thinking up those questions, let me ask you, Sivan, about early childhood. Obviously, or maybe not obviously to everybody, you're deeply engaged right now in research on early childhood, and I believe you wrote the section on early childhood in this particular article. So you describe a conflict or a tension between constructivist, child-centered pedagogy, and on the one hand, and teacher-directed Israel education on the other hand. And I guess I'm wondering, how might early childhood educators reconcile those commitments without sacrificing either of them?
So one of the things that Lauren Applebaum and I have found in our research that in doing this research for this developmental overview, we found echoes in the research of others who work with early childhood educators is this tension that you're naming. If we let children play to their heart's content, as we often want to do in early childhood settings, following their own interests and exploring the world around them in the United States or Canada or elsewhere in the diaspora is not Israel. And therefore, they might explore all sorts of beautiful, wonderful things in the world around them and never actually take interest in a faraway place that they have never been to. And if we want, as educators, as early childhood educators, to bring Israel into the classroom, we then create a tension because that is what we, the adults, want. It's actually not about following learners' needs. And my current thinking about this is that there is no way to resolve this tension, and it's really just about managing the dilemma. I really learn from the work of Maggie Lampert and others who talk about teachers as brokers of contradictory interests, and that is certainly the case for early childhood educators teaching about Israel. I think the goal at this moment is that it's sufficiently child-centered, such that children are engaging with prompts and ideas and manipulatives that are child-friendly and also sufficiently Israel-rich that educators can meet their Israel education goals. And that's a kind of an unresolvable tension.
Yeah, and I think it's an unresolvable tension in early childhood education more generally, right? Ever since kindergartens have been incorporated into schools, there's been this push and pull between pedagogy that is uh, kindergarten or, developmentally appropriate for kindergartners versus what does it mean to be part of an elementary school and how do elementary school teachers go about education. So I definitely appreciate that. Um, so I'm going to move to the Q&A, and I'm going to start with a general question that one of our listeners has. She points out that you guys have all used the term effective education a few times in relationship to Israel education. And she's interested in whether any of you would be willing to talk more specifically about I mean, I guess it goes along with best practices, but what constitutes effective Israel education? How do you know it when you see it?
Well, kind of living my day job in the evaluation space. Um, we also kind of try and avoid the terminology of successful and talk much more about effective. And effective is absolutely about the relationship between goals and outcomes. And recognizing that in this field of Israel education, people operate with multiple goals, diverse goals, and often contradictory goals. And our effectiveness in education is about the extent to which goals are realized in the outcomes produced. And that requires, before you can get to the assessment of effectiveness, some work in clarifying, articulating, making explicit the goals with which educators operate. What do they and their employers um, seek to occur as a result of their educational efforts? So I think it's really about that connection between intention and outcome that is core to determining what is effective or not.
Any other thoughts that folks have about this question of what constitutes effective education or Israel education?
Well, I'll just circle back to what we were talking about earlier, which is why we have a real skepticism for the term best practices. Um, for exactly the reason that Alex just identified. Best at what? Best for whom? Best when? All of it is contingent on a clear articulation of goals. We know from a lot of the philosophical literature in Israel education, which we purposely excluded from this research where we were really focusing on empirical studies. But a lot of the philosophical research has highlighted the fact that there is a really often an ambivalence or a confused set of goals and purposes, which is its own challenge, which gets, I think, snowballed when we think about best practices, because in order to think about designing the best practices studies that we don't even have in Jewish education, we would need a really clear sense of goals. And if we think about what the philosophical literature has shown us, it is that we as a field have a really either confused or deeply contested sense of what the goals ought to be.
Great. One of our one of our listeners is interested in the question of those of you who have taught, and I think Sivan, you're probably the person who does this the most often, but those of you who have taught in higher education, have you thought about, or how would you go about teaching about effective Israel education on the adult level, especially given the paucity of the literature, the fact that we don't have a robust research agenda. Are there certain, I don't know, preliminary, uh, I guess, points that we can, sort of best practices, or if not best practices, at least, I don't know, what would you suggest to folks who are engaged in adult education right now in terms of how to approach Israel education? It doesn't have to just be you, Sivan. It can be any of you.
Well, I'll start us off by saying this category of adult education and adult learning actually means a whole bunch of different things. And I'm not sure if the question asker was talking about the kind of adult education for emerging adults that happens in the college classroom or on the college campus. That's one kind. Actually, that in and of itself is probably two kinds of adult education. There's also adult education that happens in the synagogue, in the podcast, in the museum, the things that adult learners do in their leisure time. That's a As adults, that's another kind. There's also adult education, which is parent or grandparent education, not only about their own learning about Israel, but their own learning about how they might themselves in their own homes and families become teachers of Israel. And then there's professional learning for professional educators learning about Israel. So when we think about adult education, part of what Alex uncovered is in each of these cases, there's a paucity of research. And, but when we think about how we might want to tackle them as adult learners ourselves, we might have to start thinking about, wait, are we talking about what happens in the university classroom? Are we talking about what happens on a Tuesday night at the JCC? Are we talking about what happens in the ongoing learning for Jewish educators? Each of these is a different kind of adult education.
Great. We have a question about Hebrew educate teachers who teach Hebrew doing doing Israel education. And I think that actually kind of opens up a larger question, first of all, about what kind of research you included in this study in terms of how you defined Israel education. Would, for example, teaching modern Hebrew be considered Israel education? And then, of course, more generally, the question of, when we're talking about Israel education, developmentally speaking, what do we need to think about when we think about these discrete kind of, I guess, places where Israel education might live, like, for example, in a language teaching environment? And anybody want to take that one?
I'm happy to start us off, and I know that wading into conversations about language acquisition, that's certainly not my area of expertise. That Hebrew language instruction is not really sort of my focus. And what we did in terms of like thinking about what is included and what is excluded is articles that the purpose of the study is to understand and explore the ways that Israel itself comes up. I think that within the question that was submitted online is also this question of like, when there's only one Israel educator or one Hebrew educator within a school, and certainly after October 7th, that became an even more pronounced challenge. There's an article written by Vardit Ringwald and Sharon Schoenfeld about this very challenge, about how Hebrew language instructors who never saw themselves as Israel educators, that they taught Israeli culture, it was part of what they did, but they were never teaching about the history of Israel, the conflicts within Israel, all of a sudden became the de facto representative of Israel within their schools and were fielding questions the likes of which they had never seen before. And what Ringwald and Schoenfeld identified, that even though these teachers like intuitively knew that they were the representative for Israel beforehand, the urgency of their role was not felt before October 7th in the way that it was felt after October 7th. And they document the real challenges that these educators faced of shifting from language instructors to history instructors, to literature instructors, to crisis instructors. And that, of course, many Israel and Jewish educators in North America grappled with the fact that at the same time there was the issues going on in their own classrooms, they were grappling with that they had family and friends in Israel. For many of the educators that Ringwald and Schoenfeld address, all of them had family who were directly affected. They had friends who were directly affected by October 7th. And they navigated these questions of, I want to bring Israel into the classroom, but my Israel that I would be bringing in right now is a traumatic Israel and is a hard Israel. And how do I do that in a way that is authentic to myself and to what's happening, but is developmentally appropriate? And they didn't know how to do that. And they write about the need for new types of training for Israeli Israel educators after October 7th. And I saw Alex and
I
Great.
was, but I
Yeah.
saw
You
Sivan
wanna-
jumping in too. I just wanted to suggest that when we think about the context in which Israel is encountered in elementary schools, so much of it occurs in a foreign language. And elementary level, middle school level foreign language learning tends to come with a strong dose of sentimentalization. If I think about those horrible experiences I had learning Latin, I still feel quite sentimental about the Romans because of those sentences I was required to parse. It's all very simplified and simplistic, and that's very hard to get away from in the early year. I don't mean early years and early childhood, but in the elementary and middle school years of Israel education slash Hebrew education. And then, as Matt said, further complicated by the profiles of those who are teaching Hebrew in schools, many of whom are, I wouldn't say displaced Israelis, but people who spent much of their life living in Israel, but haven't necessarily lived in Israel recently, and so feel a kind of a gap between the Israel they know, the Israel that might exist today, and feel also, and this is something Sivan and I have talked about many times, is they see themselves as exemplars. They see themselves as having to represent a certain kind of Israel and a certain kind of relationship with Israel. All of that kind of locks in a particular let's say, not very nuanced kind of view of Israel today.
Great.
To me, the question of Hebrew also raises a question we don't address in this piece, but that I think the implications ought to be addressed, which is what is every age's superpower? So if we might think about the superpower of the young adolescent as the skeptic, right? Good, asking good questions, not being willing to just swallow wholesale whatever it is that my parents and teachers want me to do, then actually the superpower of the early childhood learner is language acquisition. There's a magic window in children's brains between the ages of 3 and 5 that makes them particularly receptive to second language acquisition. And in Jewish education, we often don't capitalize on it. And then we try and introduce Hebrew language in elementary school or in middle school in all of the kinds of pediatric ways that Alex was talking about. But we're actually missing a profound opportunity for language and cultural immersion that comes with good language immersion in the early childhood setting. So I think one question that we all ought to be asking ourselves as we think about the learners that we teach, whether we teach adults or young children, is what is the superpower of that kind of learner? And Hebrew really raises that question.
I want to acknowledge that there are more questions in the Q&A than we'll have time to get to, including, I think, some very important and compelling questions about different kinds of facets of Israel education, including when to introduce the Palestinian narrative and how to introduce the Palestinian narrative into Israel education. And although we're not going to have time to talk about that now, I want to encourage everybody to read this article, to read the other literature that our esteemed guests here have written, because that those questions are touched on in literature that has been published recently, and certainly in the past few years. I want to actually end with a question that our colleague Barry Chazan asks, It's a little bit of a provocative question. And that is your developmental model unique for Israel education, or is it ultimately a model for Jewish education in the larger sense? Anybody want to sort of pick up and take us out on that question?
Well, it's great to have Barry out there, first of all, um, and asking these kinds of questions. And as you know, Barry himself has reflected over the years, what is exactly the relationship between Israel education and Jewish education? It doesn't stand apart. And post October the 7th, we might argue that the Venn diagram has become even more intimate when we think about Israel education and the ideas we've been developing in relation to Israel education, they're even more so relevant and appropriate to the field of Jewish education.
Great. So we're going to end it there. I want to thank each of our panelists today, Matt and Alex and Sivan. I want to remind everybody that the next Mandel event is March 26th. We have a Learning About Learning on the impact of everyday anti-Semitism with Yael Silverstein. Please go to our page and learn and access our videos and podcasts of our past and upcoming events. And I'm sure that this conversation about Israel education will continue. I want to wish all of you health, safety, especially Alex. But I know that we're thinking about all of our friends and colleagues, and we're hoping for better times for everybody. So thank you all for joining us, and take care.